Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Holly Daggers, and I'm a non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's Middle East programs. Iran, a nation rich in cultural heritage and diversity, is home to various ethnic groups, such as Arabs, Azeris, Baluchis, Kurds, and religious groups, such as Baha'is, Christians, Jews, and Zoroastrians, who contribute to the vibrant tapestry of Iranian society. However, throughout the 4 decades of the Islamic Republic, the regime has not fully embraced and respected the rights of these minority communities. Discrimination, marginalization, and limitations on cultural and linguistic freedoms have persisted, creating an environment where minority groups are denied equal opportunities, are excluded, and are unheard. As we discuss minority rights in Iran and reflect on the protests that have now entered their 10th month, let us remember that the protection and preservation of the rights of ethnic, religious, and linguistic minorities is not only a fundamental principle of human rights, but also a crucial element in fostering a harmonious and inclusive society. With that in mind, it is the international community's collective responsibility to stand in solidarity with the people of Iran and be the voices of those who have been silenced for 4 decades. As many of you know, 6 months ago, the Atlantic Council launched an entirely new Iran effort, the Iran Strategy Project, or ISP. Our goal with the project is to examine Iran in line with the Council's ethos of being nonpartisan, as reflected in our advisory committee and working group. ISP's mission is to comprehensively examine challenges surrounding Iran and U.S. policy toward the country. We provide a platform for experts from diverse political backgrounds and areas of expertise to engage in meaningful discussions about Iran's future. Our work covers not just Iran's nuclear program, but broader issues like regional influence, domestic politics, human rights, environmental issues, and economic challenges. With that in mind, the Iran Strategy Project is delighted to bring you today's discussion on an issue of utmost significance, minority rights in Iran. این آخرین پیام هدف خود نظامه. This is our last message. Our goal is to overthrow the regime. مرگ بر خامنه، لعنت بر خامنه. Death to Khamenei, damn Khamenei. مرگ بر بسیجی، مرگ بر سپاهی. Death to the Basij, death to the IRGC. These are some of the chants heard from anti-regime protests in border regions since mid-September 2022. While they are smaller in size and have taken on various forms, such as graffiti, street gatherings, and rooftop chants, protests nevertheless have persisted, particularly in places like northwestern Kurdistan province and the impoverished southeastern Sistan and Baluchistan province. In Zahedan, the capital of Sistan and Baluchistan, hundreds of protesters continue to gather every week after Friday prayers in the face of crackdowns by authorities and internet throttling and shutdowns. This is also despite, on September 30th, 2022, after Friday prayer, security forces killed at least 94 people, including children, and wounded at least 350, according to a recent report by the Iran Human Rights Documentation Center. It's important to note that provinces like Sistan and Baluchistan and Kurdistan, where there is a Sunni majority and ethnic minority, have experienced daily suppression, and as a result have had a disproportionate share of the casualties. Today, through our esteemed panelists made up of human rights and civil society leaders, we will specifically address the ongoing anti-establishment protests in the wake of Mahsa Jina Amini's murder, a 22-year-old Kurdish Iranian woman that caught the world's attention, and explore the ongoing discrimination against minority groups in Iran. I now pass the mic over to our moderator, Marjan Kipour. Marjan is founder and director of the Alliance for Rights of All Minorities. She is also part of the Iran Strategy Project's advisory committee. Thank you, Marjan, and over to you.
Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. It's wonderful to see a full room here. And I also want to thank all of you who are joining us virtually. We are going to have a wonderful discussion. 2 of our panelists are here with us today. One will be joining us virtually from Geneva. And they are excellent experts and scholars, activists. We are in excellent hands, and without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panelists, and we're going to get right into it. Sabah Bandoui is going to join us from Geneva. She is a human rights defender and educator. She is a representative for Baluchistan Human Rights Group, which is an independent and nonprofit human rights organization. Sabah is a member of the Human Rights Council in Geneva, and she specializes in the rights of ethnic minorities with a special focus on women and children. She holds a master's degree in psychology with, with a specialty in counseling and trauma. We are also joined by Dr. Scott Wiener. He's a supervisory policy analyst at the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, where he covers Iran and Saudi Arabia, as well, and he oversees the Commission's reporting on Africa and the Middle East. He is the author of a recent academic book on identity and state building in the Arabian Peninsula, and he teaches a course on Middle East politics as well as gender at George Washington University. We are next joined by Shaheen Milani. He is a veteran human rights activist and a great colleague. He is the executive director of Iran Human Rights Documentation Center, and he has written several reports on for this organization. He obtained his JD from Howard University and his LLM from Vermont Law School. We are going to get right into it, and I'm going to start with you, Shaheen. Tell us about the current state of human rights in Iran. Since the murder of Mahsa Amini, as Holly expressed in her introduction, there have been thousands of arrests, so many injured, so many individuals have been murdered in the hands of the regime, others have been maimed. We have had executions. We thought that there had been a tipping point that we had reached through these massive protests. And there was also an amplification of the movement in the ethnic regions. Your organization has issued two very comprehensive reports, both on what has happened in Kurdistan and also what has happened in Sistan and Baluchistan. Tell us a little bit about what happened and why is it that after this important moment that we had reached throughout the course of this protest movement, suddenly we are seeing a reversion of the repression by the Islamic Republic with the Gasht Ershad, the mobile units to enforce the hijab coming back again this week, as well as other repressive moments. What did we do right, and how do we end up here with a reversion?
Okay. Well, thank you, Marjan, and thank you for the Atlantic Council for inviting me, and thanks to my co-panelists as well. I just want to start by talking about what happened. And I want to stress the fact that numbers don't lie. Since September 2022, we've had about 500 people who've been killed by the regime during protests and or through torture, executions, what have you. Of those, we know that at least 94 people were killed in one day in Zahedan. That's almost a fifth of those who were killed. And then we have another 100-something who were killed in predominantly Kurdish regions of Western Iran. That includes Kurdistan province, Kermanshah province, and West Azerbaijan province. So overall, perhaps maybe 40% of those who were killed either in Sistan and Baluchistan or these Western provinces. So, with that numbers in mind, it's imperative to speak about it. Now, I know that, and all of us know that this movement it became known as the Woman Life Freedom movement, and there's been a lot of coverage about particularly young women who were killed, and we know many of their names. And the movement it actually started with one woman being killed. But then there are all these other victims who are nameless to us. And they happen to come from those regions who are particularly Sunni and of ethnic minorities. And unfortunately, that really hasn't been talked about that much. When you have a situation in which this disproportionate number of victims come from particular regions, this has to be talked about. But you know how narratives work. So the narrative in the media, in the established media, is something different. It doesn't actually reflect the reality of what has happened. So what we did at my organization, we first wrote a report about the Zahedan, where again about 100 people were killed in one day, just one day. And then after that, we looked at Kurdish areas, where again about 100 people were killed, and where actually you could say the protest movement began because Mahsa Amini was from Sarkez, this town in Kurdistan province. And then subsequently, actually, we're going to also write a report about the people who were killed in Mazandaran province. That's also a place that a lot of people were killed. So my point is that the reason, for me personally, what matters is, okay, where did the highest number of people were killed? So pay attention to that. So for me, I didn't set out to write about ethnic minorities or religious minorities with respect to these protests. It's just that when I said numbers don't lie, that's what I mean. So I looked at, okay, where's been the place where with the highest number of casualties? And now there's this question that why? Why is it that these provinces bear the brunt of the regime's suppression? For one thing, it's very critical to note that the Islamic Republic is a Shia theocracy, and its ideology is just based on religious discrimination. So people who are Sunni Muslims, they happen to be in a position that their beliefs would just somehow contradict the regime's founding ideology. So naturally, it's natural for the regime to be more violent towards those populations compared to Iranians who are Shia, and that's really important to note. And then there's this ethnic angle that many of the ethnic minorities in Iran happen to also be Sunni. I mean, with Kurds, we have both Shia Kurds and Sunni Kurds, but with Baluchis, they're predominantly Sunni. And you see that, like, over the years of us documenting human rights abuses in Iran, we've noticed that the regime takes a harder line on Sunnis. It just feels more threatened by what happens in those areas. And also, I think there's a layer of access of the victims to international media. So I think the regime feels it has a freer hand to commit violence at a higher level against these populations, as it would in a place like Tehran or Isfahan.
Yes, yes. I think that really gives us a very good overview, and it gives us also an excellent segue to bring Saba into the conversation. Forgive me, I'm getting over a cold here. So Saba, tell us a little bit about the fact that Iran is represented by at least 50% of ethnic minority population with different languages being spoken. But nonetheless, as Shaheen mentioned, the ethnic minorities continue to have a disproportionate level of persecution, whether it is the current level of repression in the protest movement, but even before that, with executions, arrests, and detention, and so forth, and other problems that are there. Tell us a little bit about that. And as you answer the question, tell us, why is it that rather than serving the majority or a significant portion of their population, the Iranian regime actually tries to persecute them? Wouldn't it be easier for the regime to actually serve their citizens instead of persecuting them?
Thank you so much, and a very good afternoon to you all in the studio. Thank you so much for inviting me to your show. As Shaheen very beautifully set the kind of the platform, the base of what I would like to kind of mention as well. We need to perhaps rewind back a bit in terms of history and historically speaking about, well, since the regime has come into power, even before then, the oppression of the Kurds, the Baluch, and other minorities also existed. Now, since the regime has come into power, we can see that it has intensified. If we look at, for example, Kurdistan or Baluchistan, strategically, they are in the border countries, which also Shaheen mentioned. So with Baluchistan, for example, it's bordering Pakistan and Afghanistan, and it's very nicely also positioned where we have the Persian Gulf below in the south. And what this means is that it's also very rich in terms of import-export economy. It's rich in terms of natural resources also that are found within this region. And as also mentioned, the IRGC forces who are empower the border control in this region, the kind of transporting of drugs that is happening through Afghanistan and through this region. So it's in a very interesting location. So for a regime such as the Islamic Republic, they want to control this. They do not want the Baluch people, for example, as well as the Kurdish people bordering Iraq, for example, to have power of this region. They want to have the power to serve their own needs. And through the oppression, suppression, repression, they are achieving this. So, for example, if we think about the Women Life Freedom movement over the past 10 months, a woman in Tehran, for example, may not have the same daily struggles as a woman in Baluchistan. A woman in Tehran, rightfully so, is demanding the right to choose what they wear, whether they want to wear the hijab or not. But if we look at a typical woman who's living in a rural, in a village, for example, in Baluchistan, is in such a state, they cannot go beyond looking at when the next meal is going to come, when they can feed their children, when the husband is in a position where they have no other jobs that are offered to them, and they have to do very dangerous work such as trafficking oil, gas from Pakistan, other bordering countries, and bringing that into Baluchistan to sell for enough money to basically buy bread. They're risking their lives. This woman doesn't know if their husband will survive, they will be back the next day or not. So she's left with that kind of daily struggle, the basic human rights that she's not is not given by the regime. And this is, again, very strategically planned by this regime. They want to continue this oppression, the suppression of Baluch people, of Kurdish people and other ethnic minorities as a form of scare tactic, to keep the mouth shut, for example, so that they do not demand their human rights. For example, it's so multi-layered that I could go on talking about what is going on. But we can see that the regime has come to a desperate situation now. So after the Bloody Friday event, the 30th of September, the massacre which happened, we can see that the regime has come to a desperate situation where it's just opening fire and carelessly shooting at innocent people and children, even people who have now, it has been confirmed, bullets have been found in the back of their heads. So these are people and children who have been trying to escape this massacre, and unfortunately have been hit by these bullets. So it's a very desperate situation in these ethnic minority areas, and unfortunately it has been an ongoing situation for decades.
It is absolutely devastating to hear that, and also we are reminded that that some of this persecution, there is an intersection of a religious intersection that is involved in all of this. And for this, I'm going to bring you into the conversation, Scott. Your organization, the International Commission for Religious Freedom, issues an annual report on the state of religious freedom around the world. It's basically a barometer for how different countries are doing in terms of respecting and providing access to freedom of religion and expression in the countries. So tell us about, and time and again, year after year, Iran has been listed as a country of particular concern. Then added to that, your research on sexual and gender-based violence, again, indicates that Iran is a gross violator of or perpetrator of these kinds of violations. What is the intersection between these kinds of violations, and why is Iran considered a country of particular concern by you, Surf?
So Iran is a country of particular concern because it commits systematic, ongoing, and egregious violations of freedom of religion or belief. That's the standard that our legislation puts forward, and we don't compare countries to each other. We look at every country according to those standards. Sometimes internally there are some deliberations about whether a country meets that standard, but Iran has unfortunately never been one of those countries. The case is unfortunately quite clear. So the systematic aspect, I think, is really clear with the perpetrating event of the September 22 protest being the mandatory religious hijab laws. So the government is saying you must wear hijab in a public space. Freedom of religion or belief is an individual right. So if someone chooses to wear hijab, that's fine. But if they're being forced by a government to wear hijab, that's a violation of freedom of religion or belief, just as it would be if someone wanted to wear hijab and was not being allowed to by the government. So women are one of the largest groups that's being affected by some of these crackdowns. We've seen systematic repression of Iran's LGBTQI community. Iran's one of a handful of countries that actively executes gay men. And just last year, the Urmia Revolutionary Court sentenced to death 2 lesbian women on charges that include corruption on earth, which is a religiously grounded charge and also carries a death sentence. Religious minorities are also the target of systematic repression by Iran. I think the Baha'i community is one of the clearest examples of this. There are elements of Iran's Islamic Penal Code, Article 499 and 500, that are tailor-made to target the Baha'i community, which the government considers a deviant sect of Islam. Members of the Baha'i community are denied access to higher education. There are systematic campaigns of arrests. Baha'is have their businesses shut down. And leaders of the community, some of whom have already served a decade in prison, members of the Irani-Iran, Friends of Iran, are being retried and resentenced to additional decades in prison. So very clearly systematic. The ongoing nature of these violations is also clear because of, we know this because of the reporting that groups like ARAM, your organization, and Shaheen's organization and several others are regularly publishing on. And unfortunately, we know that these violations are egregious as well. One example from the Baha'i community is one of the former leaders, Mavash Sabet. This is a 70-year-old woman, grandmother, poet. She was arrested in July of last year, and during the prison interrogation that she was subjected to, the interrogator reportedly and repeatedly smashed her kneecaps against the wall of the cell where she was being interrogated. When we talk about sexual and gender-based violence, USERF reported on this back in April, but there's extensive evidence that this is being used in Iran, and that in particular, this is being weaponized, or the government is weaponizing religious discourses in order to magnify the harms that survivors of this violence are facing. And this includes religious discourses around modesty, religious discourses around purity, and religious discourses around gender and hierarchy. Different religious communities can discuss those issues in whatever way they like, but for the state to impose it, it adds an additional set of considerations. So we put out this report essentially for 3 reasons. Firstly, to consolidate reporting that had been a bit sporadic up until that point on Iran's use of sexual and gender-based violence. Secondly, to show that this is not just a question of lax enforcement or poor training. This is a deliberate strategy that Iran's government is using and targeting religious people in the process. And finally, to elaborate on our recommendation in this year's annual report that the US government should be supporting a UN Security Council's referral of Iran to the International Criminal Court. Both sexual violence and rape are crimes against humanity under Article 7 of the Rome Statute. And even if we're looking only at this protest, and even if we're looking only at religious minorities, there's a very clear case that both of those things are occurring.
Thank you. And I'm so grateful that your organization is documenting these reports and also holding the regime accountable. Later on today, we're going to hear from Dr. Javid Rahman, who is the special rapporteur responsible for Iran. And he will be also talking about the UN measures to hold Iran accountable. But to actually connect this phenomenon of active discrimination and active separation and alienation of minorities. I want to ask you, Shaheen, as an Iranian person, you know the country, you're in regular contact with the activists. I want to get your sense, even though there is so much constant propaganda that is being fed to the Iranians on a daily basis against the different religious groups, against the different ethnic groups, the divide and conquer propaganda that is reflected in the educational curriculum and also in the government-controlled media. To what extent do you think that these messages have seeped into the psyche and the behaviors of the ordinary Iranian citizens? Do they believe these propaganda, or do they have a more tolerant view of one another, especially since the onset of the Mahsa Amini, the Zandegi Azadi movement? Is there more understanding and camaraderie among Iranians, or do they see each other as different?
Okay, that's a very good question, and the answer to it is a bit complicated. I would say that what we saw during the protests, particularly both in Kurdish areas and also in Baluchistan, was a sense of national unity, actually. We never saw any calls for secession or any sort of discourse that is based on ethnic strife. Over and over, even I think Mahsa Amini's family, they were adamant that they rejected secession and that sort of talk. So in practice,
separatism.
Yeah, separatism. Yes. So that's the line that the government has always tried to push, to say that, well, these are separatists. And in fact, with respect to people who were killed in Kurdistan province, as our report explains, the government repeatedly tried to pressure the families of the victims to state that those who were killed by separatist Kurdish parties. Just totally fabricated. So, but what I saw, at least on the ground, was a sense of unity among Iranians of all ethnic and religious backgrounds. So that's what I saw on the ground. But there's a difference on what you see in Twitter, or on social media in general. I think in the social media, unfortunately, I think the regime has had some success in kind of pushing this idea that there is a danger of separatism. And there was, as you know, this unity group formed a few months back, but then with the inclusion of Mr. Mohtadi, a Kurdish political opposition figure, that caused a lot of consternation among, at least on Twitter. And it had some impact, I believe. But again, on the ground, I personally didn't see any sign of at least like ethnic separatism. Over and over again, I saw people in areas that you would think that there is a strong sense of, there might be strong separatist tendencies. People reflected, they expressed their views that they cared for all Iranians. And Mahsa Amini was a Kurdish woman, and you saw Iranians of all sorts in all across the country just were outraged with what had happened to her, and they came to the streets and they didn't think of her ethnicity. Now, this doesn't mean that people aren't aware of the disproportionate nature of the regime's suppression and oppressive policies. They know that, but at the same time, I don't think there is any real sign on the ground of disunity among Iranians. You can talk about the political class and outside Iran that those issues exist, but on the ground, at least I didn't see much of an issue.
So the division is mainly around, excuse me, the division is mainly around political lines, especially instigated by the cyber activists abroad. But in terms of tolerance within the country, across the religious and ethnic lines, there is more unity, and that has also been my observation. Let me actually bring Saba into this conversation, and perhaps you can tell us a little bit about Maulavi Abdul Hamid, who is the Friday Imam prayer of Zahedan, who has played an integral role in being a voice for this movement, but also a voice for unity. Even though he's a religious person, he has deferred from the establishment Islamic Republic's clergy, and he has called for unity and understanding, tolerance among all religions, equality between men and women. Tell us about Maulavi Abdul Hamid. What does he represent, and is he a psychological resort, a person that, someone that the Iranian community is listening to for psychological relief from the trauma of the regime? I'm asking you this because you are an expert in psychology and trauma as well.
Thank you so much. That's a very good question indeed. As you mentioned, so Maulavi Abdul Hamid was part of the clergy before the whole Mahsa Amini, the Women Life Freedom uprise. And he was kind of the middle person, a middleman, communicating and working with the Islamic Republic and the people of Baluchistan. So what happened after the Bloody Friday? He was put in a situation where he had to choose. Do I take the side of the regime who has oppressed my people for so long, for 43 years, or do I take the side of the Baluch people? So he clearly chose to defend the Baluch people, and rightfully so. Since then, he has played an absolutely pivotal role in what has been happening in Baluchistan. And I think with the whole woman life freedom movement, he's become a symbol of hope, we can say. Now, you don't need to be religious to appreciate what he is mentioning in his sermons. You just need to be, I think, a human being with some compassion to appreciate. So he is just talking about, regardless of religion, regardless of who you are, location where you were born, everybody should have the same rights. He's talking about secularism, not bringing religion into the government. So he has been an absolutely very important pillar holding the people of Baluchistan, and not just the people of Baluchistan, but a lot of Iranians around Iran who appreciate what he is talking about. So he is kind of a pillar holding the Baluch people, as for example, in this situation. And the regime is trying to break down this pillar. They are scared of the power that he has over the people of Iran and of this region in Baluchistan. And so they're desperately trying to give him a bad reputation, a bad name, to discredit him. And what they don't realize is that through all these efforts, it's just making them look like a broken regime, basically, that they have come to such a situation where they're trying to use this tactic. We know that they have come to probably a last resort. In terms of psychological aspect that you were mentioning, absolutely. So he is tapping into the hearts of the nation, of the people. He's showing compassion, understanding. He's talking about what is happening in the prisons of Iran, the sexual violations that are and the tactics that the regime is using to create long-term psychological effects of trauma. And this kind of trauma will last forever for a person, will be forever part of that person, and they will have to live with the psychological implications that it comes with. And it's not just that person who may have experienced the trauma of the sexual violations and many other torture tactics, unimaginable torture tactics that are happening inside the prisons. The families are also impacted. So he is a very important role. And I think, as just going back to that point, you don't have to be a Sunni Muslim to appreciate what he is saying. You don't even have to be a Muslim to appreciate what he is saying. So absolutely, he plays a fundamental role, I believe, in the movement, and is a true leader for the Baluch people.
And one of the interesting developments has been that because of the attention he's giving from his Friday speeches, the Iranian, as you said, yes, the Iranian regime is trying to discredit him, but there have also been multiple conversations that were revealed about private conversations that were tapped into, and it was revealed that they were trying to sabotage him, either imprison him or assassinate him. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
So, as you mentioned, absolutely. So there was the famous kind of attempted assassination that that we may have seen on the media. So someone who was paid by the Islamic Republic to go into his mosque, or the Masjid Makki, which is also a religious school as well, to try and assassinate him. So eventually they figured this out and they prevented this. And what happened is he was then given back to the hands of the Islamic Republic, who completely denied everything. And there is evidence to show that what they claim, the Islamic Republic, the regime is claiming, is absolutely wrong, that it was what they said it was, the Masjid Makki. And then we also heard a few weeks ago where they arrested and sent back a group of young students in the Masjid Makki school, who were Afghan youngsters, who were residents of Iran, who the parents were refugees coming in, and some of them were even born in Iran, and they sent them back to Afghanistan, imprisoned them. Forced confessions were taken from them, saying that they were many false things of they were how can I put it?
False accusations were made against them.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Interrogated by the Masjid Makki people, and then when they were released, some of them were released in Afghanistan. They then made another statement, said these were all false confessions that we had to give, basically, to save our own lives. So we can see that the regime is using so many tactics, and yet they have a religious school in Rome, which they're bringing students from across the world to come and study in this school. And it's a Shia Muslim school. And because it's a Shia school, they fund this, and it's absolutely fine to have people coming from abroad, and they even pay for everything. And yet Masjid Makki school, where they would have a few students who are self-funded, not funded, helped at all by the regime, are sent back, and Masjid Makki is accused wrongfully of things that they were not even involved with.
Not to mention the fact that there are not even regular schools, not enough availability of regular schools in the region. Scott, let's talk a little bit more about religion. Many of us are familiar with a report that a research organization based in the Netherlands released a couple of years ago. The Gaman Institution released a report several years ago that showed that Iranians are actually turning away from religion, and turning away from Islam, or at least Shia Islam, or religion altogether. That there is this new level of antagonism that has been boiling up inside among the Iranians, probably as a reaction to the level of pressure that religion had put into the lives of Iranians on a daily basis, and the freedoms that they had lost. And also, we saw an example of this antagonism and carelessness about religion last week, when there was an incident of Quran burning in Europe, and the rest of the world was very up in arms about it. But many Iranians on social media did not really care about this. They were unfazed by this gesture. And they saw it as a form of freedom of expression, and they wanted people to just get over it. Do you think that this level of this sentiment of anti-religious sentiment is a right direction for a future of Iran? And what do you think would be necessary in a tomorrow of Iran where people are free and everybody should have a right to express themselves freely, whether they believe in religion or not? What do you think are some of the fundamentals that are necessary for a future of Iran?
Well, as the only member of the panel who isn't also part of the Iranian diaspora, I'm a bit loath to get too much into the question. However, I would say that it seems like the answer is that the government would have to uphold its basic obligations under international law. And that's one of the reasons that USERV has recommended that not only the US government on its own advocate for that, but that the US work with its multilateral partners and allies and multilateral fora to help provide that level of accountability to reify the notion that international law and protecting freedom of religion or belief does matter, and that if a government wants to be taken seriously, then it needs to uphold those basic obligations. With regards to whether people are Muslim or non-Muslim or theistic or non-theistic, we're, no pun intended, but sort of agnostic on the content of the speech as long as people aren't openly calling for violence against religious groups. I think the report that you are referencing from 2020 put the number of atheists in Iran as about 9%, which is pretty significant. But the right to hold those beliefs, the right to change one's beliefs, and the right to leave religious communities is protected as an individual right under international law. And we know that the government of Iran actively persecutes people who do that. So for example, people who grow up Muslim in Iran but convert to Christianity, they often join house churches, informal gatherings, and the government of Iran likes to raid these house churches often around Christmas time, and has imprisoned several leaders of these churches, including people like Pastor Yusuf Nadarkhani, or members of the church, more recently like the case of Mullah Nazari. So people have that right under international law, but it isn't being respected. So to really impose upon Iran that that's a necessary aspect, and this is not a high bar, and this is what's so frustrating about Iran, is that for decades and decades, activists like all of you have been pushing for what really is the rock bottom of what people are supposed to be able to expect as human beings. And so I think it's sad that it's that rock bottom, but that's, I think, what it'll take.
Absolutely. I just want to remind everyone that you can submit your questions in writing at askac.org, askac.org if you want to submit your questions. I will receive the questions here and I will be happy to ask them. But before we open up to the questions, I want to ask each one of you panelists if you have a special message, if there is something else of importance that you want the audience that is present here and also listening to us around the world to take away.
I just want to mention that the Iranian regime just recently executed 2 people on the charge of insulting the Prophet. That's just killing people for their religious beliefs. That's it. With respect to people who are, atheists, or for some reason they don't believe in Islam anymore, but they're not of another religious conviction, there is no lobbying group or any interest group that would advocate for the cause of people like that, who are just being killed for not believing in Islam anymore, or even uttering something that the regime finds offensive. But we must pay attention to that, and that's the kind of a regime that we're dealing with, that just kills people for simply expressing a religious view or a unreligious view. As we talk about this government, and as a lawyer, as a human rights lawyer, we always talk about the need for Iran to respect its international human rights obligations. But that's the kind of regime that we're dealing with. And for Western countries who engage in dialogue with Iran, or who want to engage in dialogue in Iran, I think they always have to keep that in mind, that this is not a normal regime that you can deal with, I believe. It just killing people for expressing religious views is just something incredible, at this age that we're living in. And we have to always remember that.
It's killing them for their religious views and also for their political opinions, or for just simply asking for the most basic freedoms, rock bottom level freedoms that Scott was indicating. Saba, how about you? What are some of the major messages and takeaways that you want to send us with?
Thank you so much. So we all know that this totalitarian regime has been using religion as a tool, as the form of an excuse to oppress as many people as it chooses. And for example, the ethnic minorities here, it has been going on for far too long. And I think the people of Iran have had enough. There is nothing left for the younger generation. I mean, the normal average person is unable to feed themselves. The economy has gone really down, rock bottom. We can see that the Islamic Republic, the regime, is desperate. It has come. I think we can see it's in a very dire situation. So perhaps maybe a final note is that the Mahsa Amini and the death of Mahsa Amini was just kind of the final straw, we can say, for many people in Iran. They've kind of kept everything bottled up, and now they're in this moment of explosion. They're prepared to risk their lives, like a person who is hitting the streets and joining the protests on Fridays in Zahedan is risking their lives. They don't know. They could be shot. They could be targeted, even just walking down the street. They are risking their lives, and everybody's life is precious. Every single life is precious. Nobody wants to lose their life. So we've got to ask ourselves, why is it? Why are these people on the streets? They must be in such a desperate situation where they're willing to risk their lives, that they have nothing else left, that they have come to this situation, this position where they have to go on the streets and risk their lives. So I'm hoping for a very positive change. There are many things that are happening for us to even sit here and talk about this. I think is a very important and a very positive step in the right direction. But I think we are moving towards positive steps and hopefully a brighter and positive future for Iran and the Iranian people.
Hopefully. Thank you. Scott?
It is squarely within the U.S. government's national interest to be supporting the kinds of people that Sabah is talking about, people who are risking their lives out on the street, who are actively being shot, actively being attacked by their own government. It is a nice thing to do to support international human rights law, but in an increasingly multipolar, competitive environment, the U.S. can't assume that it will continue to have a leadership position. It needs to actively make that case. There are a lot of countries that have defense capabilities. There are a lot of countries that have economic capabilities. But where the United States stands out uniquely is in its willingness and its ability to stand up for human rights. And admittedly, that has been a project with an imperfect history and an inconsistent history, but nonetheless, being able to do that actively, especially on a case with Iran, is really important. When we talk about this with some of our US allies and partners, it's complicated because there's a bilateral relationship and there's the defense agreements and the economic agreements. There's no diplomatic relationship between the US and Iran, and there's broad, not universal, but broad international support for protecting people in Iran and for supporting them in the ways that they're asking for. So for the United States to be doing that is not only good for international human rights, it's also good for the United States as a national interest.
I think most of us here would agree with you. Let me just ask our technician, our producer here, do we need to switch to the next panel or do we have some time? Okay. So we're just going to continue. What do you say, I'm going to ask you actually, to politicians who will say, no, if we put more pressure on Iran, that could backfire on the very populations that we're trying to defend. What would be your message to politicians like that?
I would say, it goes to the DNA of this regime. This regime doesn't care much about what Western diplomats, Western governments say. It just has a record of brutality, and it takes its own decisions with respect to what to do. So it doesn't work that way. That somebody in the U.S. said something, so let's show them, and then execute a few people here or there. They have their own calculations, and for me, it's always difficult to get into the head of Iranian officials and to try to understand, how they operate. We don't thank God, we don't think like they do. So, I remember like back in Syria, for example, a lot of people try to understand why is Assad, using chemical weapons. And, we don't know. I mean, I don't think like Bashar al-Assad. So, and, I don't think any of us really thinks like the way Khamenei does. So we shouldn't really be concerned about, what we say it might, affect what they do. I think they have their own calculations, and we just have to stand for our principles and stick to them.
So it's another reminder that the regime doesn't necessarily reflect the desires and the priorities of the citizens. Let me address some of the questions that were mentioned here because it's very important. In her opening, Holly addressed and named the different religious as well as the ethnic minority groups that are represented in Iran. But I think that, again, being that we are a society that has been perpetually neglected, I think it's helpful to remind everyone that, yes, in addition to the Baluch and the Kurdish populations that we discussed today, there are other ethnic populations that are also represented in Iran, the Arab population, the Azerbaijani population, and many other languages and other populations that live across the country. And they all have their own needs, their own level of struggles and persecution. But yes, it is true that today we focused a little bit more, and thanks to the in-depth report that IHRDC has conducted on the Kurdish as well as the Baluch population. But if either one of you want to say a little bit about the other communities, someone has sent a question also about the fact or the perception that the Armenian community benefits from certain other privileges that the other religious / ethnic groups are not beneficiary of. If any of you want to address the other ethnic groups and whether some groups are better off than others.
Actually, with respect to the Armenian thing, I just reminded me of an episode a while back. So there's a soccer team in Tabriz, Taraktor Sazi. It's a popular team in that region. And I think they had signed on an Armenian player from Armenia to play in that team. And there was some discontent between some of the fan base of the club that they didn't like an Armenian player because it's in their Turkish Azerbaijanis. And the team actually, they let the player go. So it's a team that's owned by the IRGC, the Taraktor Sazi. It's there's no independent soccer teams in Iran. So this team, they actually committed overt, ethnic discrimination against this Armenian player, and they kicked him out because they didn't like that. So, no, Armenians, again, anybody who's a non-Muslim is not equal under Iranian law.
Correct. Scott?
Sure. So we've done tracking of some of the smaller religious minorities, including 2 members of the Yarsan community who were arrested last year, Mendean Sabaeans, Zoroastrians, and members of spiritualist movements like Irfan Khalghe, followers of Muhammad Ali Tahiri. Within the Christian community, there's a bit of a distinction between those groups that are officially, nominally recognized under Iran's constitution and some of the newer groups that aren't. But even some of the more legacy groups have faced persecution. One example of this is the Assyrian Christian community, which has come under pressure from the government to have people not participate in protests and for leaders of that community to not make statements in support of them. So it's a bit relative, but there certainly are bigger and smaller groups that are affected by this systematic persecution.
Saba, anything else you would like to add about other ethnic groups, other religious groups in Iran?
Just a point, perhaps it's worth mentioning that if a person was to apply for an official job in Iran, apparently that there is a form that they have to fill in, and they have to mention which religion they are and which, yeah, exactly. So for example, if you are another religion, or if you are a Sunni Muslim, you're automatically undesirable. So this has left, and it has pressurized a lot of people to convert against their own will. The freedom of choice of religion, it's not in their hands. So a lot of people have had to kind of have been forced to change religion, just in order to be able to get a job, to be able to survive in this kind of society. So there are a number of aspects of human rights violations that are taking place there. And as well, we can look at the LGBTQ plus community, who are targeted, using Islam as a kind of a way to, an excuse to condemn them, to not to accept them as citizens in their own country. So I would say it's not just the ethnic minorities, but there are other minorities as well who are suffering under this regime.
That's absolutely correct, and also related to that, I want to bring in one of the other questions here. But before I do, I think that with respect to the religious minorities, some of them are so persecuted that they have internalized the fear that if they speak up, their conditions could get worse, their historical sites could be destroyed, that even the small portion of freedom or space that they have to be alive and practice their religion may be taken away from them. That's why we don't sometimes hear from some of the other religious groups as well. Okay. There's a question about how the Islamic Republic exports its malign activities and its ethnic repression. For example, the mechanism through which it has persuaded the Kurds in Iraq. It could be a loaded question, but I will leave it to any of you who wishes to answer.
Sure. So one of the issues that USERV has tracked in the region is the persecution of Baha'is in Yemen by the Houthi authorities. There was a recent mass arrest at an annual Baha'i gathering with, I think, 17 members of the community. The charges that the Houthi authorities use against Baha'is are very, very similar to those used by Iran. And so there are some indications that Iran is sort of taking this model and trying to transfer it to entities like the Houthis, who USERV has designated an entity of particular concern, but to use the similar toolbox that it's using to persecute minorities in Iran to countries in the region and outside.
Do either one of you want to jump in here?
No, I think the question you asked, with respect to the Kurds in Iraq is above my pay grade, so I haven't done much research about it to be able to answer.
We'll move to the next question. 95% of Lake Urmia has dried in South Azerbaijan or northwestern Iran. Salt storms have started and ecological catastrophe is underway. 15 million people have to migrate. Is the international community doing enough to address this?
Let's say the issue of climate change and religious freedom is one that we've sort of internally thrown around a bit, but what this question really speaks to is the combination of accountability on the one hand, sanctions on the one hand, but also support for people in Iran and organizations in Iran that are doing the work of supporting the Iranian people. And so I think what we saw in, for example, in the 2009 Green Movement protests was that we had sort of the first component, but bringing in that second component of supporting Iranians on the ground is really the next step. So one of our recommendations has been to continue to issue licenses like General License D2, which allow companies outside Iran to provide technology to people inside Iran, and for the Treasury to clarify existing sanctions mechanisms to say this kind of support is okay, and to clarify that for companies that are often very risk averse to run afoul of sanctions. So it's the accountability piece and the stick, but it's also the carrot as well, and making sure that people who are actually on the ground doing the work have the support that they need from the government of the US, but also from members of the Iranian diaspora community and others who are hoping to provide that support.
I would also want to, again, remind people that many of the environmental problems in Iran are mismanagement problems, and there were many of them were preventable. And like Oromia example is just one example in one part of the country, but we have the scarcity of clean water in the southeast region and beyond nowadays. We have the sandstorms and the dry climate in Baluchistan. The sandstorms are a real deal, and they're having respiratory effect on the population, particularly on the children. And so the environmental degradation of the country is real, and it's going to create a significant problem in terms of potential migration. And it doesn't seem like the government is taking any action to resolve those problems. And rather, they're probably, based on the reports that we are seeing, they're devastating the environment even more in order to address their own problems. We are notified that Mr. Rahman has joined us on Zoom, and we're going to hopefully be able to turn to him in about 5 minutes. We do have a little bit of time, and I'm going to just give you, in advance of Special Rapporteur Rahman's conversation with us. Is there a message that you want to send to the UN? You know, the General Assembly is on its way in just a couple of months. Is there a special message that you believe Mr. Rahman, as a special rapporteur, should take into consideration? Shaheen.
Well, like Rahman is well aware of the human rights situation in Iran, and he's been working on the issue for several years, so he knows it all well. So there's nothing in particular that I want to say to him. But the UN in general and its mechanisms at this point are seen by many Iranians as ineffective, because they feel that year after year there are resolutions, and the behavior of the Iranian regime is constantly rebuked by the UN and is condemned. But nothing changes. And the fact of the matter is that this regime, doesn't really care much about being internationally condemned. To some extent, they might, take some measures, but not really, not broadly. And that UN system is based, I think, it's supposed to work in a system that countries show good faith. And with regimes that don't show good faith, it doesn't gonna have much impact. But I'm happy that the fact-finding mission was established by the UN, and hopefully in a few months we'll see the report. But ultimately, the freedom of the Iranian people rests with themselves, and with the establishment of a secular democracy in Iran. And I hope that. The UN doesn't shy away from stating the obvious, that democracy is a universal human right, and Iranian people have been deprived of it.
Thank you. And Saba, you're involved also in your work with the UN to some extent. What are your takeaways, and what are your messages and priorities?
Yeah, so in the recent the session that the fact-finding mission gave an oral statement, an update, in the council a few weeks ago, the Islamic Republic regime speaker was stating that human rights of its people are its priority, and yet what we have been discussing here, this is quite contrary to what they are showing. I think what would be great is that the United Nations, this powerful platform, puts more pressure on the Islamic Republic of Iran, puts more pressure to allow the Special Rapporteur, Professor Rahman, to be able to go personally in Iran to carry out his observations, as well as allowing the fact-finding mission to go in and to carry out its research and collect information. And yet it is denying both. So what I believe is that the United Nations needs to put a little more pressure on the Islamic Republic. However, we should not forget that the United Nations is a fantastic, very powerful platform, which can then have can play a fundamental role in putting pressures on member states and then governments, and the power of civil society and the important role that they play hand in hand with this platform, hopefully we will be able to then take the steps necessary in order to change the situation for a secular, democratic Iran, which Shaheen just mentioned.
Thank you very much. Last word, Scott.
Thanks. Yeah, so I agree with what the previous speakers have said about the importance of the UN providing accountability and a mechanism to hold Iran's government accountable for these violations of religious freedom. And the United States has an important role to play in supporting that UN work. So we've been pleased to see statements from the US Ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, as well as the statement that our US Ambassador to the Human Rights Council, Michelle Taylor, made 2 weeks ago, in which she listed out specific items that are crimes against humanity. And as Special Rapporteur Rahman has said, there is credible concern about the potential for those crimes. So continuing to investigate that seriously, supporting the work of the UN, supporting the work of the fact-finding mission, and helping to coordinate this international set of standards by which we do actually try to provide freedom of religion or belief to all, as international law asks us to do, is again a clear way and an important opportunity for the US to continue to show leadership.
Thank you. That is succinctly said, and you have very, very comprehensively said as well. Thank you to our wonderful panelists, Scott Weiner, Shaheen Milani, and Sabah Banoudi. Thank you so much for joining us. We learned so much from all of you. Thank you to the Atlantic Council for hosting this important conversation today. I feel like there is so much still to be said, but I want to thank you all for joining us, and we will move to introducing Dr. Rahman. Thank you. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Javed Rahman, who is the third and current Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Islamic Republic of Iran since the reestablishment of the mandate by the Human Rights Council. He was appointed in 2018, and he has been serving in his role since then, amid the many challenges of access and communication with that country. Dr. Rahman is a professor of international human rights law and Muslim constitutionalism at Brunel University in London. Dr. Rahman teaches human rights law and Islamic law, and he continues to publish extensively on these topics when it comes to Muslim majority states. Also, as a human rights lawyer, Dr. Rahman has provided multiple legal opinions on very high-profile cases involving religion and government. Thank you so much for joining us. It is wonderful to see you today. Dr. Rahman, I believe you were attending a graduation ceremony.
Yes, I was, and thank you for allowing me this opportunity to complete the graduation, which obviously is very important for us.
Congratulations are in order.
Thank you.
Go ahead. We would love to hear from you. We had a fantastic conversation. You caught the tail end of it, but we want to hear more about your work and also what you see coming up for Iran.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank you, and I would like to thank the Atlantic Council for this generous invitation and giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. It's late afternoon, evening in the United Kingdom, but I understand it's midday or lunchtime Eastern time in the US. So thank you very much for this this great occasion, great opportunity for me to speak to you and to various colleagues this afternoon. In this presentation, I shall begin to provide an introduction to my mandate and the role that I have as a special rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Islamic Republic of Iran. I do that because I listened to some of the remarks, and I hope that some of my comments would help clarify the mandate that I hold and the work that I do. After explaining my role as the UN Special Rapporteur, I would like to spend some time and present an overview of the situation of human rights in Iran, with a particular focus, as we have in today's event, on ethnic, linguistic, and religious minorities of the country. So since my appointment in July 2018 as the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Islamic Republic of Iran, my mandate has focused on gathering information and analysis of the human rights situation and the situation of minority rights in the country, both in terms of the trends as well as patterns of violations, but also following the cases of individual victims. The mandate that I have has provided me and others a real platform. And this mandate allows victims, civil society actors, and other interlocutors a channel to share their concerns and provide information on human rights situation in Iran, including on individual cases, events, laws, and policies. Through these interactions, I'm able to give voice to those who are suffering human rights violations. My work is reflected, as was alluded to, in my reports to the General Assembly, to the Human Rights Council, as well as in my communications, press releases, and my efforts of engagement with the Iranian authorities. So that said, notwithstanding my consistent requests to the Iranian authorities, and again, this was the point made earlier, that notwithstanding my consistent request to the Iranian authorities to allow me access to the country, I have been denied this request. And this has been, this has been a consistent policy of the Iranian authorities since I took over the mandate, but also my predecessors were also not allowed access into the country. This denial of access is also a breach of the provisions of the Human Rights Council resolution, which establishes my mandate, and it requires authorities to allow access to the Special Rapporteur to the country. Now, ladies and gentlemen, please allow me to turn to the subject of the human rights situation and the minority rights issues in Iran. As we speak, the people of Iran are facing the worst forms of violations of human rights. Ethnic, linguistic, and religious minorities continue to suffer from systematic and systemic persecution, targeting, and harassment. Women and girls of Iran are targeted with the most serious assault on their fundamental rights and human dignity. And I call that gender apartheid. I am hearing reports just this week of the restoration of the patrols of the so-called morality police, which is intended to further violate women's rights and their dignity by attempts to enforce the hijab. As you know, the death in custody of the morality police of Jina Mahsa Amini on 16th of September last year unleashed one of the strongest waves of protests and civil unrest Iran has seen during the past 4 decades. Jina Mahsa Amini, a 22-year-old Iranian woman from Sakaz in the province of Kurdistan, was arrested by Iran's morality police on 13th of September while she was on a family visit to the capital, Tehran. She was arrested for allegedly failing to comply with Iran's strict rules on women's dress by wearing the so-called hijab. She was deemed to be wearing it improperly. The death in custody of Jina Mahsa Amini is unfortunately a tragic reflection of the violence against girls and women of Iran. In her case, there are also clear implications with an ethnic and religious dimension attached to her killing. However, the law of enforced hijab and the manner of its enforcement by state authorities is emblematic of violence, brutality, and the violation of fundamental human rights and human dignity of girls and women of the country. The death in custody of Jina Mahsa Amini resulted in spontaneous protests, which were led by women and the youth of Iran under the banner of Zan Zindagi Azadi, women, life, freedom. These protests quickly transformed into nationwide protests, spreading to 160 cities and all 31 provinces of the country, with people from every community, girls, women, men, children, and people from all ethnic and religious backgrounds joining these protests. Unfortunately, there has been a brutal response of the Iranian authorities to these protests. It is estimated that at least 537 people, including 68 children and 48 women, have been killed by state authorities, and a significant number of protesters have been injured, while thousands have been reportedly arrested, detained, or incarcerated. Dozens have lost their eyes because of direct shots to the head. Iranian doctors have also reported women and girls participating in protests having been targeted with gunshot fire to their faces and other sensitive parts of their bodies. There are consistent reports and the testimonies of torture and ill treatment of protesters, including sexual and gender-based violence. Iranian authorities have tried to shut down all avenues of freedom of expression, disrupting internet and censoring social media platforms. I'm deeply disturbed at the reports of threats, arrests, and imprisonment of journalists for their critical and independent reporting, including in the context of the protests and the subsequent school poisoning. As some of you would be aware, the two journalists, Niloufar Hamidi and Elahi Mohammadi, who reported the death of Jina Mahsa Amini, were arrested on 22nd and 29th of September 2022, respectively, and are currently facing trials for charges which carry the death penalty in revolutionary courts. I'm absolutely horrified, shocked, and outraged that despite appeals by the international community, including by my own mandate, Iranian authorities have thus far executed at least 7 persons associated with protests after arbitrary, summary, and sham trials, which violated the right to fair trial and due process rights. These summary executions are the symbol of a state ready to use means or all means to instill fear and quash protests. I'm very concerned that several other individuals face charges that carry the death penalty. I'm alarmed at the reports of targeting and victimization of ethnic, linguistic, and religious minorities. This includes the disproportionate execution of ethnic and religious minority prisoners, in particular those belonging to the Baloch and the Kurdish minorities. Arab and Azerbaijani minorities have been consistently targeted and victimized, while non-religious minorities are subjected and they're increasingly repressed and persecuted. It was thus tragic to note that ethnic and religious minorities who have suffered decades of systematic and systemic discrimination and persecution have been disproportionately impacted in the current wave of repression. There has been a gross overrepresentation of ethnic and religious minorities in the killings of the protesters that started since September 2022. Over half of the total number of persons killed since the start of the protests are Balochis and Kurds, and that confirms the seriousness of the risks that we face in terms of minority rights in that country. Children from Iran's Balochi and Kurdish minorities constitute 63% of the recorded child victims since the repression started in September of last year. As of 31st of December last year, 130 Balochis were killed by the Iranian security forces. The deadliest incident on record since the start of the protests happened on 30th of September in Zahedan, Sistan and Balochistan province, when Balochi ethnic minority members demonstrated after Friday prayers as a show of solidarity with nationwide protests and to demand accountability for the reported rape of a 15-year-old girl by a police commander in the province. As people gathered outside the police station across the road to protest and chant, security forces fired live ammunition, metal pellets, and tear gas at protesters and bystanders from the police station rooftop and the rooftops of several nearby houses. A majority of victims were shot in the head, heart, neck, and torso, demonstrating a clear intention to kill or to seriously harm these persons. Kurdish areas, particularly the southern regions of West Azerbaijan province, Kurdistan, and Kermanshah, have also witnessed extreme repression and killings of at least 125 Kurdish protesters, including 13 children and 8 women. I remain extremely concerned at the heavy deployments in the Kurdish minority cities of Iran. The Iranian authorities have unfortunately weaponized death penalty as an instrument of fear and repression. Ethnic minorities, including minority women, continue to be disproportionately affected by executions in 2022. Out of the estimated 582 persons executed last year, at least 147 were Balochis, who, as you would know, only represent 2 to 6% of the total population. This is a great travesty of justice. That is extreme unfairness. It is unjust. And more than half of these Balochis, more than half of these 147 Balochis that I've mentioned, have been executed for drug-related charges. Amongst the estimated 354 executions that have taken place from January 1st this year to 30th of June this year, at least 71 are Balochis. My report to the Human Rights Council in March 2022 and March of 2023 have firmly established my conclusions that there is an absence of accountability for serious human rights violations and for crimes under international law within the political, constitutional, and legal system of Iran. In my view, the scale and gravity of the violations committed by the Iranian authorities, especially since the death of Ms. Amini, points to the possible commission of international crimes, notably the crimes against humanity of murder, imprisonment, and forced disappearances, torture, rape, and sexual violence and persecution. So what about the position of religious minorities, in particular the constitutionally non-recognized religious minorities? The absence of constitutional legal recognition for the non-recognized religious minorities entails denials of fundamental human rights for their followers. Baha'is, Christian converts, Sufis, and others who are left outside the national legal framework as unrecognized minority religious groups are targets of discriminatory legislation and practices. They also face discrimination and exclusion in other forms, including, for example, in inheritance laws and in employment laws, for example, facing the so-called Gozenjash requirement, whereby they're meant to reflect knowledge of Shia Islam and loyalty to the state, which remains a requirement for their employment in the public sector. The situation of the Baha'i minority remains particularly disturbing. The Baha'i minority has continued to face all forms of targeting, victimization, harassment, and persecution, including through detentions, unlawful arrests, confiscation, and destruction of their properties, denial of education rights, closure of businesses, and cemetery desecrations. Christian converts are not recognized as Christians, but are deemed as apostates, which under the constitutional legislative interpretations of Islam renders them apostates and therefore liable to death. Christian converts are not granted access to officially recognized Christian churches, which forces them to gather secretly in informal house churches. Many do not make their faith public for fear of persecution once identified. Christian converts risks arrest, detention, and and repeated interrogations about their faith. Iranian intelligence services have continued to closely monitor churches and harass congregations, in some cases with regular checks of identity documents of attendees to ensure that only members of the recognized Armenian or Assyrian Christian minority attend these services. There have been reports of arbitrary arrests and detentions of Christian converts. Most Christian converts who have been arrested and detained have been charged with serious offenses, including national security offenses. The repression and persecution of sexual minorities has continued, as on 1st of September last year, 2 LGBT rights activists were sentenced to death for vaguely worded and broadly defined charge of afsad fil ard, that is corruption on earth. I have consistently demanded from the Iranian authorities the protection of the rights of all persons belonging to ethnic, religious, and sexual minorities. I've asked them to eliminate all forms of discrimination against ethnic, religious, linguistic, and sexual minorities, both in law and in practice. I have also demanded the release of all those imprisoned for exercising their right to freedom of religion or belief, for exercising the right to enjoy their own culture or for using their own language. I have also demanded that policies are introduced and resources invested for the economic, social, and cultural and political development of areas populated by the ethnic, religious, and linguistic minorities, in particular the Balochis and the Kurds. I thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to our discussion later on in this event. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rahman. Thank you for your remarks. And thank you also for your advocacy and for your diligence about covering Iran, having a 360 perspective on a country that is hermetically sealed and does not want information to get out. I think I share the sentiment of many of us in the room when the sentiment of gratitude for the work you're doing, but I also share some level of frustration with the UN as an institution for some of the previous privileges and rights that they had given to the Islamic Republic and allowed them to obtain legitimacy in Human Rights Council and so on and so forth. But also the slow nature of change. I know that there is efforts underway. The fact-finding mission has been effective, but progress is slow. Can you tell us a little bit about what we can anticipate in terms of the different mechanisms of the UN and whether there would be any hope in sight?
Yeah, thank you very much for this important question. I think that we are doing important work. My own mandate is very important for the people of Iran. I think you should continue to engage with my mandate, and I'm consistently serving the people of Iran. I talk to people both inside of Iran and outside. We have campaigned very strongly, for example, for the establishment of an investigative mechanism. You mentioned the fact-finding mission. We speak to member states of the Human Rights Council, as well as to the General Assembly more broadly, about issues of accountability, about constitutional reform, about the overall human rights situation. Now, one thing we have to remember and acknowledge that international law operates through states. And as an independent expert, I can approach different countries, different missions, but I need support from the civil society, from victims, and from other interlocutors. And I acknowledge the great support. But together, we must reach out to the international community. Now, it is very disturbing for us to notice that Iran, the Iranian regime, has put in place or is putting in place further restrictions, further violations of the rights of girls and women through policies of enforced hijab, but also what I just mentioned, a scheme of gender apartheid. So let us reach out to member states, let us reach out to the international community, and together we work to engage with the international community so that there is enough pressure on the Iranian regime not to violate and degrade the rights of girls and women. That's just one example. Obviously, I note what previous speakers said and what you were saying, that there is an element of a kind of a feeling that more can be done or more should be done. I take note of that. I get that. I think what we need to understand is that international law or international affairs are run by states. So we must work within that system. We must work through the Human Rights Council, which is the key body, which has that power, which can hold states to account. There are mechanisms which we can make greater use of. I mean, obviously, my mandate, the fact-finding mission, but the UPR is coming up. The next UPR is coming up, a Universal Periodic Review of Iran. Then individual states can also exert more pressure on Iran. And therefore, I would recommend very strongly that together with my mandate, with the civil society, I think we can work within the ambit of international law to ensure that the rights and dignity of the people of Iran are respected.
Thank you very much. We're going to end it at that. Your message is loud and clear. We will do our job as activists and as community members. We will try to amplify the voices of the Iranian people who are really trying to get our attention, get the media's attention. And we hope that everyone in their power, using their platforms, whether it is international media or the UN, U.S. Commission on Religious Freedom, and our independent human rights organizations, we will all do this and not lose the momentum that has been generated in Iran. Thank you very much for joining us today. Thanks to all of you for participating and your excellent questions. And thanks again to our panelists. And of course, thanks to Atlantic Council for hosting the conversation today.